This is the horrifying story of the Bear Brook Murders. Between 1985 and 2000, 4 bodies were found crammed into barrels in the woods of Allenstown, New Hampshire, and authorities believe they were victims of the chameleon killer. 4 bodies were discovered in 2 55-gallon steel barrels at Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire, filled, wrapped in plastic bags, and skeletonized. The case baffled authorities for years, and nobody was able to give them a name for years. Instead, they were known as the Bear Brook Murders. Strangely, the second drum wasn't found until 2000, although the first was discovered back in 1985. However, it was evident that the same individual was responsible for all of the murders. However, it transpired that the individual has had multiple identities during his life. The killer was referred to as Curtis Kimball, Larry Vanner, and Bob Evans at various points in time. His true identity was discovered in 2017, which was 7 years after his death. They were still unsure of the victims' identities, though. While the identities of 3 of the victims will be revealed, the identity of the 4th victim is yet unknown. This is the twisted story of the Bear Brook Murders. Make sure to subscribe and click the bell icon before we proceed. A big, industrial steel drum was discovered in 1985 by a hunter who was hiking through Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire. He discovered 2 mutilated plastic bag-wrapped and utterly skeletonized carcasses within. After further investigation, it was found that they had died somewhere between 1977 and 1985. The bodies were eventually buried in a nearby cemetery with a tombstone that read, "Here lies the mortal remains known only to God of a woman aged 23-33 and a girl child aged 8 to 10. Their slain bodies were found on November 10, 1985, in Bear Brook State Park. May their souls find peace in God's loving care." Since then, the case had gone ice cold. Then, in 2000, 15 years later, a second 55-gallon drum was found nearby. It's not apparent how detectives had missed it more than 10 years earlier, but the second barrel held the identical 2 young girls' disfigured bodies that had been preserved in the same way. However, there were no immediate hints provided by this revelation as to the identity of the murderer. Although the bodies were undoubtedly slain around the same time as the last 2, the inquiry came to a standstill once more because there was no way to identify the deceased or obtain any other information. Investigators were able to identify Terry Rasmussen, who passed away in prison 7 years prior in 2010, while serving a sentence for the murder of his then-girlfriend, Yoon Jun, in 2017, thanks to the use of genetic genealogy tools. Rasmussen had served time in jail for larceny under the alias Robert Evans in the early 1990s, according to the Los Angeles Times. Before that, he had served time in prison for drunk driving and endangering the welfare of a child in 1985, as well as for operating a stolen car under the name Gary Mockerman in 1988. Later, he left that child in a trailer park, calling her Lisa, and pretending she was his. After this incident, Rasmussen stayed off authorities' radar for a little over a decade. By 2001, Rasmussen was operating under yet another alias, Lawrence Vanner, and doing odd jobs throughout California. That same year, he married Yoon Jun in an unofficial backyard ceremony in Richmond. However, no marriage license was ever submitted. Jun's body was discovered mutilated and buried in her cellar a year later. Strangely, at his trial, Vanner entered a guilty plea to the crime, notwithstanding the counsel of his attorneys. His fingerprints were used by the authorities to connect him to the previous incidents of child abandonment at that time. After determining through DNA testing that the man had not been Lisa's father, an inquiry was launched to identify Lisa. Lisa discovered the identity of her mother, Denise Baudin, after sending a sample of her DNA to an ancestry website. Denise was a single mother, and Dawn was her only child. Soon after Thanksgiving in 1983, Beuden and Dawn, who was a baby at the time, vanished from their Manchester, New Hampshire home. Bob Evans was the man who had been their housemate. In 2017, Bob Evans had passed away, and detectives thought he had murdered Denise Beaudin once they had left New Hampshire. Even though there were still a lot of unanswered issues and holes in Evans's background, investigators now had a vital piece of information. Bob Evans, real name Lawrence Vanner, had resided in New Hampshire in the middle of the 1980s. Subsequently, the individual officially recognized as Terry Rasmussen was linked to the bodies discovered in Bear Brook utilizing DNA evidence. His daughter had been one of the victims. "We believe we have our killer," said New Hampshire Assistant Attorney General Jeffrey Strelzin at the time. "Now we need to identify and try to find all of his victims." The strange, singular situation was examined in the podcast Bear Brook, which was published by New Hampshire Public Radio in October 2018. The identities of the victims remained unknown to the investigators, even though they knew who had killed them. The podcast had rekindled interest in the case and drawn the attention of Becky Heath, a 34-year-old Connecticut librarian. Heath started searching the internet in her spare time for any hints. "I got a little crazy with it," she said. "I would go to work, and I'd come home, and I would just research and research and research." She stumbled onto a post made online by Sarah McWaters. She described herself as McWaters' half-sister. In their comments, several others expressed their belief that they were related to Sarah, one of 3 family members who had disappeared sometime in the late 1970s. The family consisted of the infant Sarah McWaters, her elder sister Marie Elizabeth Vaughn, and their mother Marlies Honeychurch. Terry Rasmussen's name also came up as Heath continued his investigation and messaged a few of the relatives who had attended. Honeychurch was with Rasmussen when she was last seen. Simultaneously, genetic genealogist Barbara Ray Venter independently identified the victims using their DNA in a novel method involving autosomal DNA, which is located inside the nucleus of the cell. Autosomal DNA could not be recovered from hair strands that were detached from the root. However, a California forensic lab has been developing a new technique to piece together the fragmented autosomal DNA found in rootless hair. Ray Venter identified the victims using this method after months of trial and error. In October 2018, Heath gave the authorities her tip. In June 2019, the victims were given formal names. Now the only question that remains is, who was the middle child, Terry Rasmussen's daughter and 4th victim? Who do you think it is? Make sure to subscribe to the channel and stay updated.